God can transform what Satan intends for evil into something good. It's been written, when you can't trace the hand of God, you can trust his heart. He wants the best for us.
Welcome to Mission 66 from the ministry of Pastor Luis Sayao and Transworld Radio. Today, we'll be studying the book of Job, a book that teaches us that no matter what happens, our God is still sovereign and sees us in our troubles. Grab your study guide at mission66.org and follow along with John Matthews and Esther Sisulu as we discover how these timeless stories speak into our lives today. Let's get started.
Perhaps you've heard about the patience of Job. Now, Job was tested by the devil almost beyond human endurance. And in the Bible book that bears his name, we'll find out that it wasn't Job's patience so much as his unwavering belief and trust in God that enabled him to endure. Today, our teacher, John Matthews, will lead us through Job chapter 2 with the theme, Faith Under Fire.
Esther, thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to this latest episode of Mission 66. Whatever your situation and wherever you're joining us from today, it is so good to have your company. And yeah, we saw in the last episode, which covered the first chapter of Job, that Job's suffering was not because of anything he had done wrong, but it was a test of his faith. Here you had Satan challenging God, saying that Job was not sincerely faithful, but that he's only praising God because things are going so well for him. Satan says to God, well, why wouldn't he praise you? Look at what you've given him. And then he asks permission of God to put this man, Job, through the test of suffering to see if he would fold and melt like a snowball in the summer sun. And I think it's surprising to us that God actually gives the devil permission to test Job. And so he does. And the tests are tragic because Job almost overnight loses all 10 of his children in a tornado that strikes their house. He then loses all of his livestock and his hired servants to robbers and murderers. But at the end of the chapter, after all of that, the grief and the dismay felt by Job to the devil's dismay, this is what Job said in response to this seismic loss. He said, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And the devil, perhaps still believing that he could make Job crack and capitulate and disown God, so he goes back to God and he asks permission of God to turn the heat up even more, believing that if he could strike Job's body with painful sores, agonizing sores, then he would start to give up on his faith. And so to this challenge, God then gives Satan permission to strike Job with this agonizing pain. Is Job going to maintain his faith under this kind of fire? Given all that had gone before, don't forget, he's suffering the trauma of all the tragedy that we saw in chapter 1. And now in chapter 2, it's a short chapter, but it's going to get worse for Job. And there's so much in here for us too. Let's read it. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord, saying, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." And then Satan answered God, saying, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand, touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." So the devil, about to test Job already praising God in spite of losing all of his wealth and all of his children, but now Satan about to ramp up the test again, inflicting bodily suffering on Job. This is verse 7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself whilst he sat in the ashes. This is faith under fire, almost more misery than a single human can bear. But the distress is about to become even worse, and it comes from someone who, well, the person who is closest to him in his life, his own wife. Verse 9. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" And in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, one may have expected some more encouragement from his wife. And here, as Job's 3 friends come to visit him, they couldn't even find the words either. Verse 11. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon Job, they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show Job sympathy and comfort. And when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. And they raised their voices and they wept. And they tore their robes and they sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and nobody spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Now again, we remind ourselves that this was not a test to see if Job could remain faithful. God was confident that Job was capable of sustaining his faith even through the darkest trial. And God speaks on Job's behalf. It's remarkable that God can trust the faithfulness of one of his servants in this way. But he knows the character of Job. He knows what he's made of. And from this point forward, as we move into the next chapters, we're going to explore the conversation between Job and his friends as they grapple with this question of why? Why is this suffering allowed? Why is God allowing this suffering? And Job was never allowed actually to know the whole reason behind his intense suffering, that it was a satanic challenge in the spiritual realm. He never knew that. And that God had actually permitted the suffering. And in the same way, we're often beset, aren't we, by many trials and sicknesses, and it causes us to say to God, "Why, Lord, why?" And sometimes we are allowed to perceive a reason why, but not always. But God does not willingly bring suffering on any one of us without good reason. And one day we will fully understand, but we're not there yet. But one day we will be.
This is Mission 66, and together we're taking on the book of Job, chapter 2, with our teacher, John Matthews. And now we've come to that part of the show where we'll get into some questions. And of course, I always have a bunch of them, John. And I think we can start off with this one. What do you think Job's disease was? Because it sounds quite painful.
yeah, we don't know what this disease is, but whatever it is, it causes disfigurement. His features are distorted. His friends don't even recognize him. And there he is as they arrive, sitting on the ground in ashes, scraping his sores with broken pottery. We can only imagine that provides some kind of relief to the pain and the itch that he feels. So we're thinking, even though it's probably doing more damage, well, clearly it is doing more damage. And so these are, these running sores all over his body from head to his toe. Some scholars might or have suggested that Job's condition may have been leprosy, skin cancer, or even elephantiasis, which causes parts of the body to swell up with fluid. But look, we don't know for sure, but we do know that it was agonizingly painful and unsightly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you definitely get a sense of that reading this passage. Now, I actually know that there are different schools of thought as to who Satan is. And I'd like for us to give clear understanding of who Satan really is. Is he a person or is he a concept? And how do we know for sure who he is?
Well, we know for sure that he's real, and we know for sure that he's a fallen angel, Esther. Well, look, the Bible isn't written to explain all mysteries, nor could we manage to understand those mysteries if they were revealed. Now, the origin of Satan is one of those mysteries about which we are given some but not much information. But there is a little to go on. So, look, we consider the Bible to be the most reliable source of anything that we learn about Satan. And while it doesn't tell us everything, what it does tell us is true. So the first thing to know is that Satan, like all the other angels, is a person. And he is a created being who is limited in power and in knowledge. The next thing to know about Satan is that he was a highly esteemed and beautiful angel. We're told that in the Bible. But because of pride, he leads a rebellion against God, and he and a host of angels are thrown out of heaven. They're cast down and out of heaven. So Satan goes from being this beautiful angel who honors God to being God's arch enemy. In fact, the enemy of all that is good. But make note again, that's not how he started out. And Ezekiel chapter 28 actually tells us, Esther, that he was once not only a beautiful angel, but he was, listen to this, the guardian cherub in heaven, perfect in all his ways, until iniquity was found in him. So something changes there, clearly. The guardian cherub in heaven moves from perfection, and somehow iniquity enters him through pride. And he becomes proud because of his beauty. And at some point in eternity past, he thinks, I want to be like God, or I want to be more than God. And so what does he do? He organizes a rebellion against God, hoping to oust God and take over heaven himself. And so convincing was he that he drew, we're told, a third of the entire angelic host into this plot to overthrow God. And we read about that in the book of Isaiah, the prophet, chapter 14, who writes about the king of Babylon, but he's likening this to Satan, Lucifer himself. Let me read it. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. And it talks about Satan falling from heaven. This is what it says. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. So that description shows us that the devil becomes evil. And he says, I a lot. I will, instead of God's will be done. And so here we have the arrogance of pride, and it turns something that is perfect. We're told that one of God's most beautiful creatures into a snarling, malevolent, evil being that becomes capable of no good whatsoever, because God is removed entirely from him, and so is God's love. Now, Satan is not and never will be equal to God, and will never defeat him any more than a sailboat could defeat a battleship. And the angels who followed Satan into his rebellion, they become demons, and they have been condemned to the same fate as Satan, and that is hell.
Whew. The Bible paints quite the picture, doesn't it, John, of the devil's rebellion. And I wonder, when did this rebellion take place?
Well, we don't know when, Esther, but 2 Peter chapter 2 offers perhaps a little insight into what happened and indeed will happen to these fallen angels. Peter writes, by the Spirit of God, in verse 4, that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but he cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. And we find a similar description in Jude verse 6, which says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Jesus himself revealed to us that he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Luke chapter 10 verse 17, and that he is a defeated foe and will ultimately be judged. Read Revelation chapter 20 to find out where the devil is finally thrown into the lake of fire. In fact, hell was not created for human beings. Hell was created for the final punishment of the devil and his angels. Unfortunately, sinful, unrepentant mankind, having bought into the devil's program of rebellion against God, will, without the forgiveness and the love of God, without coming to him, that's all we've got to do is come to him. But without that, we share that fate. And what is hell? It's an eternity devoid of God's love, which means an eternity devoid of love, full stop.
John, we do read somewhere in the Bible that the devil drew a third of the angels in this rebellion. But where exactly does it say that?
Yeah, that comes, Esther, from Revelation, the last book in the Bible, chapter 12, and it talks about the great dragon, who is Satan, whose tail swept down, it says, a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. And we know it's talking about Satan because the same chapter identifies the dragon as that ancient serpent called the devil, Satan, who drags down to earth a third of the angelic host in that rebellion against God.
All right. Well, I think you rightly described Satan in that he is devoid of any good. In fact, the Bible calls him evil. But in him being evil, why is it that he's allowed to access heaven to protest against God?
Yeah, you're right that God allows him this temporary access, but certainly not as a dwelling place anymore. And he cannot do anything whatsoever that God doesn't allow. So God sets the limits, but Satan is like this vicious dog that snarls and bites, but effectively he's tied up on a leash of a certain length. Now, God is not afraid of the devil. Everything that happens in the world happens because God either causes it or allows it. Notice Job himself says, shall we accept the good from God and not trouble? And that means that Job trusts that God knows what he's doing. He knows that God works things out. It grieves God when we grieve. More than it grieves us, even it grieves God. So he feels our pain, but he knows sometimes that it's necessary to bring about the end that is perfect and desirable for us and for him, and that he's working things out for the very, very best, even if when we look around us and everything that we feel in our bodies and in our minds and in our souls might tell us differently, and it doesn't feel that way right now.
John, I imagine that there may be someone listening right now who asks themselves, well, does God allow the devil to get to his children in the same way that he did Job, to test us like he did Job? How would you respond to that kind of question?
Look, I'd simply say, Esther, that we don't have the capacity to comprehensively understand why God allows Satan to harm Job. God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts, as it says in Psalm 103, are not our thoughts. And so our understanding of God's perfect and supremely wise ways are so limited. But by way of example, and I think this suggests why this happens here, we know that loving parents allow temporary pain for reasons that their children do not understand. And the same, I think, is true in this story. But one thing is certain: Satan is limited in what he can do.
All right, John. Well, someone who does feature in the story is Job's wife. Let's talk about her for a moment, because her reaction to Job's suffering doesn't quite make much sense, right? She urges him to curse God and die. Let's get into the psychology behind that reaction.
Yeah, Job seems to have more faith than his wife here. He responds, you're speaking like a foolish woman, meaning somebody who does not know God. Now, she's not necessarily prompted by Satan, but her suggestion aligns with Satan's goal of trying to make Job curse God because of his suffering. So his wife doesn't have the clarity of what's going on here. She wrongfully believes that he would be instantly struck down if he cursed God. But let's think a little bit about where Job's wife was at and what she had seen. And clearly there's a lot of frustration, and suffering, as we know, requires an awful lot of patience that sometimes we just don't have the capacity to show. And days can be long and weary, and suffering can bring out the very worst in us. And so those close to us in moments of pain can say things that we wouldn't normally say. And I think it's a good example of times in life where we just need to be people who forgive other people and people who act with empathy and sympathy to those going through times of suffering, and how important it is for us to encourage and support those who are going through tough times.
John, you mentioned that suffering at times can bring out things within us that wouldn't ordinarily come to the surface. And I've actually heard of people who became Satanists because they believed the devil would reward them with worldly wealth and happiness and would protect them from judgment. And that's such a flawed view.
Well, the devil is a liar and cannot be trusted for anything. And he delights in deceiving people. And look, if Satan convinced a third of the heavenly angels to follow him, angels who were witness all the time to the glories of heaven and the majesty of God in utterly perfect surroundings, well, if he could convince a third of those to follow him, he can certainly deceive fallen human beings. But you can imagine, can't you, those demons now realizing the consequences of their following the devil, chained in darkness, awaiting their doom in hell, saying to each other, How did we manage to give up the perfection of heaven and the glory and the love of God to listen to the liar? How did we manage to end up here?
Yeah. I really think that it takes more faith to believe the devil I mean, he's a proven historic liar. I think it's much more simpler to believe God's word because he has been proven to be trustworthy.
So I'd say to that yes and no. Our hearts are deceitful beyond all things. And if we drift from God and from his enabling spirit in our hearts, then our flesh loves the opportunity, supported by powers of darkness, to deceive us. And so our job is to surrender all to him day by day and remain close to him. And then I get your point. Faith makes so much sense and nothing compares to it. But our hearts deceive us quickly again if we allow them to. And, Satan is a liar, but he's not only that. He's also a thief and he's a murderer. And he has absolutely no care nor concern for us. And he has nothing to lose because he's lost everything. He's been condemned to eternal flames. Ultimately has absolutely nothing to offer us.
Thanks, John. I mean, these are some really good thoughts. And I think this really calls for soul searching on our parts. But this has been a fantastic look through the second book of Job. So let's go ahead and move into the summary for today.
Yeah, well, the story of Job is revealing to us, Esther, this profound lesson about faith in the midst of suffering. Job's trials, they weren't punishment for wrongdoing, but they're a test allowed by God to demonstrate his unwavering faith, Job's faith under fire. Faith gifted him by God. Satan challenges God. He claims Job's only faithful as long as these blessings are flowing into his life. Why wouldn't he be? Says Satan. So God permits Satan to test Job first by taking away all 10 of his children, then removing all of his wealth, later afflicting his body with these agonizing sores from head to toe, which we've just read about. But despite this unimaginable suffering, Job remained steadfast, declaring, well, shall we receive the good from God and not accept the evil? And even when his wife urges him to curse God and die, his friends sit silently, overwhelmed by his suffering. Job still does not sin with his lips. It's remarkable as I think about it, and how many times I've sinned with my lips, and Job here doesn't. And the story reminds us that suffering very often serves incredible purposes known only to God. And whilst we may, and quite rightly, ask the question, why? We're not owed an explanation whatsoever. God's sovereignty assures us that trials are allowed for good reason. God takes no joy in it, far from it. He feels our suffering and pain, even when the reasons make absolutely no sense to us. And ultimately, Job's story, it encourages believers to keep the faith during tough times, because it's always there that he does his biggest work in our hearts, because he and he alone can transform what Satan intends for evil into something of incredible worth and good. It's been written, when you can't trace the hand of God, you can trust his heart. He wants the best for you. Believe that.
And that is where we'll leave it for today's episode of Mission 66, leaving you with incredible nuggets of gold found in God's word that you can meditate on until the next time we can journey through the book of Job. Well, I'm Esther, for John Matthews and everybody here on our team. See you next time.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.